So good afternoon and welcome to the final instalment of our partner webinar series, Landscape Recovery, the Adur River Recovery Project. I'm Kate Miller, Head of Marketing and Strategic Partnerships here at EcoSulis. And today I'm really excited to welcome our presenter, Knepp Wildland Foundation River Recovery Manager, that was a mouthful, Mel Sanders, who's also joined by Alex Briggs, Project Manager for the Wheel to Waves project. The format for this hour will roughly be a 30 to 45-minute presentation from Mel and Alex, and then there'll also be an opportunity for you to ask questions at the end. Please can I ask you all to submit your questions through the chat function, and I will pose these through to Mel and Alex on your behalf. If there is time, we will try and do some live Q&As at the end. Normally, I have to say we don't get time, but if we do, I will really try to do those because I think they're a great opportunity for us to kind of meet you and have a bit more interaction and engagement. If you do have some additional questions following the webinar, please do send them across to us. Liv on the chat will pop our email address on at the end of the session for you to send these to. The session today will be recorded and it will be emailed out to you. We hope you enjoy the session today and we look forward to receiving your questions. It's now time, hopefully it works this time, for me to hand over to you, Mel and Alex. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate, for that lovely introduction. So Alex and I both work at the Knepp Wildland Foundation, which is the charitable arm of the Knepp estate down in Horsham in West Sussex. And they've been running a rewilding project there for about the last 20 years. And the foundation was really born to catalyse nature recovery across Sussex beyond Knepp, using the lessons learned from the rewilding project. So we facilitate and host several projects, which we're here to talk to you about today. So the project that I work on is the Adur River Recovery Project, and the Adur is our local river here, runs through the Knepp estate. We're quite high up in the catchment, so we're just about here where the red dot is. But the catchment itself is about 500 kilometres squared, and it's quite a prominent Y-shaped. As you can see, we've got this western branch and this eastern branch, and they come together around the town of Henfield to form this one large embanked channel, which runs for about 15 kilometres to the sea at Shoreham, and that's about a 15-kilometre stretch, and it's tidally influenced. And you can see the picture down here. This is one of the embankments. They're quite prominent within the catchment. In terms of the geology, is quite useful for us to understand a basic understanding of it. Just explains a little bit about how the river reacts to the weather events. So in the upper catchment, it's more of a sandstone geology, so water and rain can permeate through the ground, whereas in the lower catchment, it's more clay dominated. So when it rains, we see the river running off the land and hitting the ditches, the streams and the rivers. And those rivers and ditches rise very, very quickly. And when we have that at the same time as a very high tide, we get quite severe flooding in the area. And our project is in that lower area. So we're dealing with the clay catchment. In terms of what lives in the Adur, we're very lucky because we have that tidal influence. So whereas most inland rivers obviously don't have estuaries, we do. So we don't have very many designations in the catchment, but we do have the Adur Estuary SSI, which is incredibly important for its intertidal mudflats. So when the tide goes out, we get a lovely range of wading birds, including redshanks and curlews, coming down to feed. And then as the tide comes up, the birds go off to roost and rest before coming back down to feed again. So there's a really nice interaction there between the freshwater and the marine habitat. And again, we also see migratory species such as sea trout. They come up to spawn, and other migratory species such as the European eel. We have a really lovely ditch network all along the catchment, and we quite often find eels in those. However, despite finding all these wonderful species in our catchment, there could be more, and the Adur faces all kinds of problems and challenges, very similar to our rivers across the UK, really, very similar story. But it receives urban runoff, wastewater from water treatment works, and agricultural runoff as well, which all contributes to degradation of the water quality. It's heavily modified. So as I mentioned, we've got these large embankments, and you can see those in the photo here. It's quite difficult to get an idea of the scale, but they're a few meters high in places. They really are containing the river. But there's also quite a lot of weirs and flow structures. This is, again, it's difficult to tell from the picture, but this is about 6 foot, this weir. So really posing quite a big barrier to fish passage, particularly those migratory species I mentioned, and also degrading the habitat upstream of it, so impounding the channel. I mentioned that the river joins the sea at Shoreham. It's a really heavily urbanised area. This picture down here is right next to that estuary, SSI. So the habitat down there is quite squeezed. We've had quite a lot of new development right up against the SSI. These are big warehouses, which are just kind of, squeezing the habitat and limiting the area for those species. For example, when the wading birds feed on the intertidal mudflats, they would have gone and roosted on that kind of open land, especially the lapwings. And now that habitat's becoming more and more squeezed, we're seeing fewer birds using the intertidal mudflats. Of course, climate change is affecting everything, but particularly we're noticing in our catchment we're having extremely wet winters and sadly summers this year. But as I said, when we get those big tides and heavy rainfall events, the catchment that we're in does really react very quickly, and we do see quite significant flash flooding. Conversely, in the summer, with it being a clay catchment, we see our wetlands can pretty much completely dry out and become very kind of hard, dry fields. And our river's flow also becomes very, very low during the summer as well. So we've got these two extremes, and all of that really is contributing to habitat loss, which then contributes to species loss. We know that we've lost loads of our wetlands, 90% over the last 100 years, and obviously that has an impact on the species. Of course, when we impact our biodiversity, it has implications on us as well. So we're seeing a huge cost from flooding financially, but also to people and to infrastructure. We're in a really water stressed catchment here. So even just in the last year, we've seen water pressure being lost to some towns and houses, and that's only going to get worse. And of course, all of that contributes to our ability to create food and produce food in the future. So, we need healthy ecosystems to help us farm, essentially. However, all is not lost, because that's how the Adur River Recovery Project has come about. So our project is a landscape recovery project funded by DEFRA, and we've got 5 partners. So it's facilitated by me at the Knepp Wildland Foundation, but we've also worked with the Ouse and Adur Rivers Trust, Sussex Wildlife Trust, Horsham District Council and Adur District Council. So we've got a really nice range there of conservation partners and local councils. And we're working with 27 land managers to create this lovely connected corridor of river habitat. And it's very much a land manager-led project. So we have a steering group which governs the project, and that's chaired by a farmer. And we've got several farmers within that project as well. So we're very much taking a steer from them on how they want the project to evolve. And what we'd like to see across this 766 hectares of riparian and floodplain habitat is this beautiful wetland ribbon, all the way from Knepp and the eastern arm down to Shoreham. And very importantly, we're looking at land that isn't particularly productive. So we're just looking at the floodplain and riparian areas, which doesn't have a great calorific value, but it does have a really big biodiversity value. So we're very much making space for nature through a farm landscape and looking at those areas that aren't particularly desirable for farming. So this is the 766 hectares of riparian land, the dark blue areas here. And that equates to about 25 kilometres of river. And we're very much looking at long-term nature recovery with these landscape recovery projects, about 20 to 30 years of delivery. And it's part of the DEFRA's Environmental Land Management Scheme, ELMS, which I'm sure some of you have heard of. And the idea of landscape recovery is to restore nature at scale, but collaboratively and long term. So it's big projects over a long period of time. We're one of the round 1 pilot projects. There's now round 2, and I think round 3 is quite soon to be announced. But as part of round 1, we've got about 40,000 hectares across the UK. There's about 600 kilometres of rivers. But the idea is to create these long-term projects that are financially sustainable as well. So we really want to benefit biodiversity, of course, but it needs to work financially for the farmers that we're working with as well. So we're coming up with a blended finance plan to fund the project through the long term. So in terms of opportunities, we're very kind of the aims of the project really are to reinstate the natural processes within the Ada catchment and to restore its natural function, because it's obviously at the moment quite heavily modified and it's not able to behave very naturally. So the kinds of things that we're looking at doing are realigning and breaching the embankments. So this will help to increase connectivity between the river and the floodplain. At the moment, we're seeing flooding happening and overtopping the embankments, but then the water is stuck behind them. So there's just not that nice connectivity between the river and the floodplain. Where the river's been straightened in places, we're looking to re-meander it into its old channel. We'd like to create and restore existing wetland and salt marsh habitat. We don't have very much salt marsh in the area, and we would do naturally. So we're looking to restore some of that's really precious and not very much of it around. We'd like to improve fish passage. So those weirs that I mentioned earlier, some of them we'll be able to remove, others perhaps not, but we'll be able to improve their passability so that fish and eels can use them or potentially bypass them with bypass channels. We're also looking at tree planting along the riverbanks and in the floodplain and riparian zone as well. The Ada is not very well shaded, and as it does get very hot in the summer, it's really important to be able to maintain cooler areas of water for our fish species. A lot of the farmers already farm with nature in mind, quite extensively, but we're just looking to more farmers to adopt those practices or just to continue them across the catchment. And I'm sure some of you are familiar with what these kinds of interventions look like, but just to give you a flavour of what they do look like. The top picture here is a picture of a scrape, which is a wetland habitat. It's essentially a very shallow pond, and it has these lovely muddy margins, which are really good for the wading birds, and you get lots of invertebrates, dragonflies and the like, living in them. So really nice to have those on the floodplain to create that kind of mosaic of habitats. The bottom left is it's called the Woodsmill Stream, and this is a tributary of the Ada, which has been restored. Can't remember exactly when, but it has been restored. And you can see it doesn't have very steep banks. So we've got here there's not much difference between the kind of the floodplain area and the channel. So it's got really nice connectivity with its riparian area, and there's lots of nice vegetation. You've got some faster flowing areas and there's some deeper areas here. It's a bit harder to see, but it's really nice diverse channel habitat. It's really healthy channel. And then this picture here is just an example of what riparian tree planting would look like. It's essentially fencing off a section between the field and the river, so you've got a healthy bank, and you can either plant trees or you could let them regenerate naturally, but again it's about creating those nice shaded areas to keep the water cool. A really, really big part of our project is engaging with our local communities, and this is one of the things that we were quite successful in our bid. It really helped us to get our funding. So knowing that we live in quite an urbanised area, we wanted to know how the community feel and use the river. So last summer we put out a community consultation to try and get an idea of how people view their local river. We had about 550 responses, which was more than we thought we would get, but all of them reflected how much the river means to them, and how much they care about it. Following that, we asked people if they'd like to be involved in the project or on the river itself, and we had over 150 people express an interest. So again, a bit more than we anticipated, but really, really exciting. Since then, we've established this River Ada Festival, which is a way for us to engage with our community. So we're going to some events that are already running, things like farmers markets, raft race. We have a raft race every year, just to try and get the project out there, share what we're doing really, and try and garner kind of citizen, like a citizen-led aspect of it. So we've also, as part of the festival, running some citizen science initiatives such as Riverfly. We've done 2 training sessions of that so far, which have gone really well. We're also working with local community groups such as the local ornithological society. So they're taking people out on bird watching sessions. We've partnered with a local paddleboarding group to take people on paddleboarding safaris. And we're also partnering with a local artist who is running some workshops to make wading birds out of rubbish found on beach cleanups. So again, keeping that nice marine and freshwater link going. And what we really want to do is to keep this momentum going throughout the project. We'd like to keep the festival running annually and to kind of pick up that momentum to enable communities to foster the sense of ownership that they already feel, or the value that they feel around their local river, but actually be able to feel like they're actually making a difference. And then we've got a quote here on this picture, which is from the community consultation, which I think is really lovely. We had quite a few quotes like this, but this one says, "It's like a friend you want to visit in all seasons and tide times." I think that's a really lovely quote. So in terms of the timeline, we put our bid in February 2022, and that was successful in summer 22. The project began in January 2023, and in the summer, last summer, we started big baselining activities. So this is where EcoSealers came in, because we're working with them to collect as much baseline data on the catchment as possible. So we're looking at ecological surveys, we're also looking at collecting information on the habitat condition and type to set us up for biodiversity net gain, and we're also looking at carbon as well. Alongside that, we visited all 27 farms in the catchment to chat to the farmers and the families about what it was and what it is that they want to do and what their vision is for the river, to start getting a bit of an idea of what those opportunities and interventions might actually look like. And then they all received a report outlining those activities. Fast forward to this year, we're now starting to model and design those interventions, starting the FRAP process, eventually all the kind of flood risk impacts that come with doing anything along a river. We also, as I mentioned, initiated our River Ada Festival, and we started the discussions with funders as well to start developing up that blended financing scheme. So next year we'll finish this phase. So it's about 2.5-year phase called the development phase, and we should hopefully have an idea of where our funding is coming from. We'll have our legal agreements in place as well. We're working with an external consultant called Bates Wells on that. And that's where our DEFRA seed funding ends, and our blended finance begins. And that takes us through then to our delivery phase of 20 to 30 years. So by the end of summer 2025, we should then be starting to deliver some of these interventions. Other things that we're looking at will have a really big impact and on various different elements, and provide us with a variety of ecosystem services. So where we're looking at re-meandering the river and increasing the length of the channel, we're slowing the flow of water reaching its downstream point, and by enhancing the floodplain and its wetland areas, we're enhancing its capacity and ability to store water. So that will have impacts on flood and flood mitigation. But it'll also help us be more resilient to drought if we're able to hold water within the floodplains and wetlands throughout the year rather than just in the winter. Floodplains, wetlands, particularly wetland plants, are very, very good at filtering out nasty pollutants. So we hope to have an impact on the water quality, improve the water quality. And all of this will help to uplift biodiversity. When we've got different habitats and a mosaic of different habitats, we hope to see more species and a greater abundance of those as well. It's really important to note that our project is part of the bigger picture in Sussex. I'm going to hand over to Alex in a minute to talk a bit more about that, but we're one of a growing number of large-scale nature recovery projects in Sussex. We are part of the Wheel to Waves, the ambitious 100-mile corridor in Sussex, one of 3 rivers. And we also critically form this link, again, going back to the marine freshwater connection. We create this link between the inland habitats and both the Sussex Bay and the Sussex Kelp projects, which are happening offshore. I think it's probably a good time now to hand over to Alex, and we can take questions about the river afterwards.
Excellent. Right, we'll do our nice low-tech swap over.
Yes.
Thanks, Mel. Right, thank you, Mel. So yes, sorry, that's our quick low-tech swap. So hello everyone, I'm Alex, as Kate quite kindly introduced me earlier. So I manage a slightly different project to Mel that shares the same landscape. And so this is the Wheel to Waves corridor, and my first slide. Oh, if I can get it to work. Yeah, there you go. My first slide is not, I think, going to be a surprise to anyone whatsoever listening to this. But Wheel to Waves really is a recognition of the scale of nature decline in the landscape, and an attempt to try and meet that scale with an ambitious large scale vision for nature recovery across Sussex. and recognizing that a major driver of biodiversity loss and the biodiversity crisis is unsustainable land use that has led to habitat fragmentation and impermeable landscapes. So in lots of ways, although the State of Nature report and everything else that we hear in the news is really depressing, in lots of ways, I think we are in quite an exciting period for conservation, and there's a few reasons why I think this. But number one is the sort of shift towards landscape recovery, and in addition to the kind of traditional, what I would call sort of fortress conservation, where you've got a nature reserve or a space that is quote unquote for nature, that you essentially defend to the best of your ability, but struggle to address the causes of decline in the broader landscape, and of course that lack of recognition of the broader landscape issues is what's led to partly what's led to the state that we are in with biodiversity at the moment. So in Sussex particularly, we've got some fantastic landscape scale nature recovery projects going on. We've got Wildland works with our local nature recovery partnership, that's in the late stages of developing our local nature recovery strategy for the East and West Sussex landscapes, and there are a variety of really exciting more local projects, from things like Wild Horsham District and Wilder Ooze that are looking at engaging with farms and parish councils locally, to things like the national park, and we've got several national landscapes, areas of outstanding natural beauty as were. We've got a really beautiful county in many ways, but there are still these issues going on, and what we're attempting to recognise is the thread that runs through and connects all of these projects, which is habitat connectivity, and this is the opportunity that we're building on with Will to Waves. And we've come at this from a slightly different approach. So we are a farmer-led project, and it started really with this chap, James Baird, who is a farmer along the Climping Gap, which is a stretch of land along the Sussex coastline, which is essentially it's the entirety of his farm makes up one of the last undeveloped stretches of Sussex coastline. To the east of him, there's Bognor Regis, and over to the west, there's a long coastal strip of Littlehampton, Shoreham, and then Brighton, which includes the mouth of the River Adur. So James is in a really interesting position for connectivity and landscape scale nature recovery, but across his lifetime, he's been incentivized, as many arable farmers were, to pull out hedgerows and increase his inputs into the land to try and increase his yields and his calorific values, and he's recognized the decline of nature within his own lifetime, and now wants to do something about it. For him, that doesn't necessarily mean moving away from food production, and there is still very much a place for food production, but within a more sustainable landscape structure, and I'm going to talk a lot more about that in just a moment. But he essentially reached out to Knepp. So these dots in the landscape, the bottom left hand side is this is James down here. This dot up here is Knepp, and as part of the book Wilding, Isabella Tree wrote about that it's great what they've already achieved at Knepp, but essentially it becomes, going back to this term fortress conservation, if they can't address the major roads that sit right on the boundary of Knepp. We've got the A24 that forms a hard boundary to one side of the rewilding project, and ultimately these great efforts become islands that can't succeed because you get genetically isolated populations of your nationally significant wildlife species there. So James reached out and said, how can we think about reconnecting our land parcels? If you want to come down and reconnect with the coast, then I'm the place to go. And this is an idea that picked up momentum and interest, and actually what we ended up with was a flood of land managers who shared James's concerns about the nature declines they had seen in their own spaces, and wanted to join up their efforts. So this is the picture of the founders of the Will to Waves project as they signed the memorandum of understanding a couple of years ago. And really the exciting thing, and the reason I show you this picture, is because these are mostly land managers from across Sussex. You know, about 2/3 of them are you know, there are the usual suspects from the conservation industry in Sussex. But yeah, like I say, we are land manager led, and that is really key to engaging a whole new audience with nature recovery. We can't just do this with the natural spaces. We need to think about the landscape as a whole. And this is the map that we arrived with. And so we go, the corridor stretches from the Ashdown Forest in the north down along the three rivers, the River Ouse, where there's lots of work going on for nature recovery from a civic sense. So there's lots of campaigns for the rights of nature. Then down along the River Adur, which is predominantly farmer led, and this is, I'm tracing here the route of Mel's project. And then along the River Arun, where there is much less action, but equally lots of problems with water quality and water pollution, particularly. So it's a really exciting concept, and an example. I'll give you a very quick example now of why we have this dire need for wildlife corridors, and you know, why we need to tie into the marine environment, for example. So across in Sussex Bay, once upon a time we had a thriving kelp forest that was about 200 square kilometres, and kelp being this amazing seaweed that forms these great big structural, literally forests underwater, that form really important habitat for fish nurseries. This was gradually degraded over years of increasingly intensive bottom trawling, up until the 1980s, where there was essentially very little kelp forest left, about six square kilometres of that original 200. So almost a complete collapse. And so a few years ago there was a bylaw introduced to protect that forest by banning trawling in the near shore. But what is still inhibiting the recovery of that kelp is sediment, and that sediment being washed off predominantly bare agricultural and urban built-up surfaces, washed out through our rivers and down into the marine environment, where it literally smothers the seabed and covers up the bare rocks that kelp needs to form holdfasts, as well as blocking light in the water column. So actually what we can do with Will to Waves is talk about things like regenerative agriculture, where you've got solutions like continuous cover cropping and companion planting, so that you've actually got your ground is covered throughout the year. So you've got your productive crop that is then immediately replaced with another crop when you harvest it, which makes your farming system, your food production system, much more resilient to climate change, because you've not got your earth being baked. But it also means that you're getting less of your farm literally being washed away into the rivers, that then inhibits marine conservation. So it's a really nice example. It's why I give it of why we need this landscape scale approach of connectivity. So Will to Waves is aiming to do several things, and one is to create a wildlife corridor, but that is a more complicated picture, and I'll say a bit about what I mean by that in a moment. But also to look at ecosystem services across the landscape, look at things like nature as a regulator of our fresh water quality, as a producer of our food, as a producer of clean air and health and mental health, and how we can quantify and value that to support nature recovery. But also to engage with people and to provide a mechanism for people to get behind this idea of a wildlife corridor. So just to illustrate, this is land use across the UK, and I just show you this quickly to illustrate that this is the sort of statistics nationally and then for the Sussex landscape, and I just want to illustrate that really we have a higher proportion of farmed and urban landscapes in Sussex. So really this is just to point out that model of fortress conservation and natural spaces for nature and human spaces for humans just doesn't work anymore. We need to think about what humans really need, and how we can support natural habitat within our human spaces. And that doesn't mean pushing humans out of those spaces, but it means a more sustainable and thoughtful land use, so that wildlife and society can thrive together. And that's why I say that wildlife corridors are a little bit more complicated than just a big strip of land for nature. We do need that, and we do need to reconnect our habitats through landscape corridors and through linear features like hedgerows. But we also need stepping stones, you know, and these, from our perspective, could be small patches of land like gardens and green spaces, and little habitat blocks, but thoughtfully planned out alongside more sustainable land use in the landscape more generally. And that means looking at our food productions, and the way we use land for leisure as well. So a big part of our engagement work is to get people to think about this and show these landscape scale pressures. So things like light pollution and noise pollution. So this is just an example we give to get people thinking about bats moving across the landscape and how these actually fragment populations. And yeah, and I highlighted really that we need to think about this we need to look at the landscape through a species lens, such as bats, but we also need to look at nature recovery through the lenses of economists and community activists as well. So the way that Wheel to Waves works is that we're essentially asking people to sign up and take a pledge for nature. And that pledge is fairly open-ended, so we're forming relationships and taking pledges from the farmers and the landowners across Sussex, but also the communities and the individuals and the gardeners, and asking them to sign up whatever they can do in their spaces to form part of that landscape corridor matrix. So essentially asking them to sign up for 30% of their land by 2030, and that can be really complicated. You know, it can be margins around a football playing field. It can be people looking at wildlife gardening within their own spaces, and it can be farmers looking at regenerative agriculture across their entire food production, all to form part of that landscape corridor matrix. So the point is that whatever you've got within your spaces, there are really exciting things to do, and for the different types of members we offer slightly different things, from that guidance and community building and encouraging people to get behind that vision, which we're already seeing as being really important locally, to feel like their community efforts are tying into a bigger picture and can really make a difference, to the business case for nature. And this is where it's really important, the way that we work together with projects like the River Adur, and in our landscape, this is tying back to what I said at the very beginning, along with the move towards landscape scale conservation. The other really exciting thing about the period that we're in is that there is increasingly going to be a business case for nature, and biodiversity net gain is kind of the first step towards that, but there are much more exciting things coming, and the potential that actually lots and lots of large corporates are going to need to invest in nature recovery, and they will need projects to drive that, and things like Wheel to Waves and the local projects going on within the corridor are going to be one of the recipients of that potentially. And the vision of Wheel to Waves can ultimately funnel money into this corridor, which is why it's so important that we work with the River Adur in developing what is essentially their business case for nature, to allow them to take the project forward into the future and into its delivery phase. And so this is where we are now with the corridor in terms of sign-ups and pledging. So this is about 13,000 hectares of land pledged to Wheel to Waves. So you can see what we're driving at when we're using this pledging mechanism to try and essentially fill these gaps between the pledged areas. So we're really excited. You know, that's about 17% of the corridor now pledged, and we have a real challenge to now use this to demonstrate that this really can work, and that for the farms and large blocks, this really can form a part of their business case. And ultimately, it's not nature recovery through a philanthropic lens anymore. We all need to engage in this so that we have as a society, sustainable future, sustainable food production, and continuation of things like mental health and physical health that nature provides us with, and that we've been so bad at ultimately valuing in the past. So as part of people joining, they get a number of different things back from us. But the ultimate part of that is being part of a sustainable future for Sussex, and a future of sustainable land use. So that roughly finishes up what I want to say about Wheel to Waves. And I think hopefully we can pass you back to next slide. Is there one more slide now? There we go. Right, there we go. Sorry, that's us doing our live tech. So thank you very much, everyone. I think Mel's just coming back, so we'll be very happy to take any questions.
Fantastic. Thank you both so much. That was both really great presentations. And also I have to comment, obviously being a marketeer, I do absolutely love the graphics and imagery you've both used as well. Definitely food for thought. I've just been messaging the marketing exec saying we need to speak to Alex about this. They look beautiful. Thank you. And I have to say, Mel, I was absolutely blown away by your community engagement. 500 people came forward to offer their thoughts around the river. And to me, that just shows just how important it is to them. This is really central to them, isn't it? It's amazing.
Yeah, we hadn't anticipated that. I mean, I'll be really, really pleased, but especially an online consultation, you know. So yeah very chuffed.
Brilliant. And I think as well, I think it's just paramount as well to such kind of nature recovery projects that you do kind of bring stakeholders such as farmers along that journey. I think they're just vital, aren't they, in terms of creating the connectivity, but also to be able to deliver that wholescapes approach. I think without them, the project just wouldn't be feasible, would it? You have to have that kind of buy-in and that stakeholder engagement. It's amazing just to see how passionate people are about the project as well. Thank you both so much. So I'm going to move across to some questions now, if that's okay. So the first is from a lady called Sandra. I'd love to hear more about the blended finance plan for the ADA LRS. What stage of development are you at in building the plan? And do you have funders identified on board yet, for example?
Yep. So we've basically put together a business pitch that we're using now to approach local businesses. So a few months ago, we did a workshop to identify regional businesses that we thought may have an interest in investing in the project. We basically created a shortlist, and we're now using the material that we put together, basically marketing the project to send to interested businesses in the area. And we just had started our first conversation. Really, we had our first meeting yesterday with a business, and we've just started that this week. So we're just starting those conversations and garnering interest.
Fantastic. Thanks, Mel. I think sometimes that's the trickiest part, isn't it? It's running, you engage people, but I think it's hard. I think investment in nature recovery is tricky, but I think it is, I think in partnership, I think we're definitely coming up with lots of different and innovative ideas for how we can kind of secure that funding as well.
Yeah, and the market isn't really there yet. But it is coming. But I think that when landscape recovery came about, I think definitely probably thought that the market would be further along than where it is now. And obviously we do have such a short time scale to work to, that 2 years. So foot is on the gas. But it's been positive so far.
Fantastic. Next question is from Gemma. Is the re-meandering part of a strategy to reduce the number of weirs?
So the re-meandering part is less focused on the weirs. That we are looking at those as part of the project, but the re-meandering is more where the river's been straightened and canalised to try and get the water to flow downstream as quick as possible. So the re-meandering is really looking at increasing that river's length, so it takes longer for water to flow downstream to basically reduce the amount of water that's hitting the nearest point that floods all at the same time. But also about enhancing the channel habitat as well, because where you have a straight, deep, canalised river, you don't get that variation in aquatic habitats. Whereas when you do have a more natural river, you get deep areas, shallow areas, nice like vegetated margins. So it's about slowing the flow of water and also habitat enhancement.
Fantastic, thank you. A question from Matt: which organisation is coordinating all of these projects / initiatives?
So that's the Knepp Wildland Foundation that Mel briefly mentioned at the beginning. So that kind of came out of the success of the Knepp Rewilding Project, and is now a charity with its own independent board that looks at various projects. So mine and Mel they're the most exciting ones, I think, aren't they? But there's all I can't. I'll get shouted at if I say that. But we also coordinate various other projects, including the White Stork reintroduction, and we also look at education with our Wilder Futures programme across both at Knepp and at the across the Will to Waves corridor as well. So we've got various other projects kind of ongoing and in development.
The Scrubland project.
And the Scrubland project, yeah. So this is within really within Will to Waves, and it's partly because we're kind of in that slight interim stage with nature markets, where ultimately the hope is that very little of Will to Waves will be grant funded, and there will be a lot of work on the nature market side of things. The Scrubland Superheroes was kind of one of our initial habitat creation projects, looking at creating these stepping stones of scrub across the Sussex landscape, as kind of a demonstrator of the concepts that we're talking about, and as the best way of using grant funding across that landscape scale. And ultimately that might tie into the natural England reintroductions of redback shrike and black veined white butterfly as well. So there's lots of exciting opportunities with these projects tying together.
Fantastic. Well, I will say Alex and I facilitating our projects at the foundation, but they are very much partnership projects, so very collaborative.
Yeah.
Brilliant, thank you. I've got a double question from Tanya. She did offer her apologies and said she will listen back. She just said she'd like to ask the question of whether partnering with financial support as part of local offset gain has been discussed.
Well, as part of biodiversity net gain.
I'm assuming so, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so we're certainly looking at that. As I say, we're collecting, as you'll know, Kate, the UK HAB data, which looks at the type and condition of habitat, which can then be used in the DEFRA metric. So we're very much lining up the landowners for that, but we're not relying on that solely, and it won't be the sole funding mechanism or the dominant one for either projects. But we're certainly planning to use it to some extent, and we're chatting with our local councils and gearing ourselves up.
Yeah, brilliant. And also, if the landscape recovery funds have assisted through enabling a coordination of elms payments.
Say that again. So has the landscape recovery scheme,
has the landscape recovery funds assisted through enabling a coordination of elms payments?
So we're looking at elms payments. We're kind of we will have some DEFRA funding. So the project, when we go into the delivery phase, it won't solely be private funding, and some landowners already in countryside stewardship schemes, and there's quite a lot of SFI, Sustainable Farming Incentive Initiative payments.
Incentive. Sorry.
I remember all these acronyms. So yeah, well, it's kind of that. We are supported by them. We have a Natural England advisor on our steering group. So yes.
Thanks, short. A question from Matt: is current legislation, so planning, protected species, statutory consents, etc., a help or hindrance?
That's an interesting question, isn't it? There's a lot of layers to that answer. I mean, it depends a little bit on the lens that you're looking at. I think, well, from a top-down level, for example, there's the local nature recovery strategy that was kind of mandated for all of the counties to look at across England, which is producing this strategy, and that's fantastic. But they are hindered by the fact that they don't have a delivery mechanism. And so they're looking at then, once these strategies are written, how can we actually make this work and make this work for landscape scale conservation? So yeah, this is and this is potentially why Will to Waves is partnering and working with the LNRS quite as much as we do, is that we will likely play quite a significant role in doing that across the Sussex landscape. So yeah, there's certainly upsides and downsides, and I think, and I mean perhaps a more specific example is the sort of the difficulty of more specifically towards sort of species and landscape protections and designations, is that they don't normally they're not particularly adaptable for change. So where we've got things like climate change, and there are multiple sites across the Will to Waves corridor and in your project where change is going to happen, and that will probably mean that the degradation of SSIs and other designated sites and species, and ultimately there is very little we can do about that, but there are adaptations we can make to make those landscapes more resilient, which are not always possible under those designations. So your hands are a bit tied, and you just have to watch these important sites degrade over time because of the. So it's a really interesting question, I think. I don't know if there's any particular examples from Ada.
Yeah, I mean, with the embankments on the tidally embanked section, at the moment, obviously we are getting overtopping, but generally speaking, we're not getting huge seawater influx into the habitats. But obviously the habitats behind those embankments will change significantly, whether we do something or not over the years. These embankments are failing. They're failing now. So if we're getting breaches of salt water, the habitat behind there is going to be different. So yeah, it's complicated.
Yeah, connected projects are always super complicated, aren't they? In terms of trying to get the best outcomes for each habitat. It's quite a challenge, isn't it, at times? Got a question from Rebecca, just checking time. Citizen science is becoming a key source of additional data. Good to hear about the initial project. Will there be more projects planned as part of things ahead?
Yeah, certainly. Citizen science projects. I mean, yeah, yes, absolutely. We're quite a small team at the moment, so we're just trying to do what we can in terms of that. But particularly for the Ada, we're having all this baseline data collected at the moment, but going forward, we'll need to keep collecting that. So working with EcoSulis, we're trying to come up with methods that are repeatable, and the idea is that we will have citizen input into those. We're setting ourselves up on iRecord. She's been that by naturalist. iRecord. So that, I mean, we've got so many expert groups in the area, and there's loads of people already out there collecting data, but obviously we want to keep it in one place so that we can all use it. But the idea is to get people out there recording data so that we can keep an eye on what's going on within the Ada and also within Will to Waves as well.
Yeah, and there's a huge amount to be gained from, not just from a data perspective, but from an engagement perspective, and we with Will to Waves, we've got communities signing up that are really keen to know more and find out more about what they've got in their spaces, and are looking and thinking about biological recording for the first time. So there are loads of things that we can do at that scale that kind of inform locally as well as inform across our project areas and objectives.
Brilliant, thank you. Got a question from Ella. It's brilliant how much support the project has had and how many landowners are involved, but has there been any resistance or negativity from landowners and local communities, and how have you engaged these groups to gain support from the project?
Both answer that.
Yeah.
So do you want to go first?
I'm happy to go first. So I think so our project came about, I'm not sure I mentioned this, the landowners that were in our project came about through a farm cluster, and it did happen quite quickly, so it was very much about getting signatures and land signed over to the project. And the landowners that signed up were all at different levels, I would say, I think it's fair to say, of engagement. So some were super keen and others were a little bit more hesitant, which is totally understandable. It's a pilot project and there are so many unknowns. And I think that is still the case now. We don't have the answers to everything being a pilot. We are the guinea pigs. We are creating this blueprint, which is also really exciting because, we're creating this scheme. We're not being told what to do, but it is difficult. And we're looking at 20 to 30 years of commitment. It's a huge amount of time. And there are positives with that. CS schemes are quite short term. So it's great to have like a longer term thing, but it's also a big leap of faith basically that we're asking these landowners to make. So really, we've really focused on trying to work with the best expertise that we can on the baselining, the legal side of things, and the financing, but also trying to supply as much information as well to make it kind of just to try and equip the farmers with as much information so that they feel able to make that decision and they understand how the catchment's going to look in the future, you know, what this project means in terms of increasing their resilience to climate change. So we've been on a few site visits to look at nice river recovery and wetland salt marsh creation habitats, just so they can actually visualise what it might look like, and just really try to keep that engagement up, going to visit them regularly. And I think, you know, there's more and more stuff happening in the catchment. We've got the Wild to Waves, we've got the local nature recovery strategy, we've got the marine projects, and I will say that there are some gaps on that map where we don't have landowners, but that doesn't necessarily mean they're not doing anything. They are actually in other projects. So yeah, I think, you know, we're going in the right direction, and yeah, we've got really good enthusiasm from our farmers.
Can I answer that question from a completely different perspective as well, if we've got time?
Absolutely, yeah.
Because yeah, we kind of have this challenge a little bit with Wild to Waves, and it's our challenges are completely different. But it is quite an interesting mirror to the national conversation and around food versus nature. And you know, it's something that you'll see again and again in all of the parties' manifestos from the recent election. And there it is, you know, really divisive issue. And we're in a really exciting place with, you know, as Wild to Waves as a project, to say, well, it doesn't need to be. There are really exciting things that we can do if we look at this across the whole landscape. We're not just looking at these individual sites and taking it back to nature. We can take a broad overview and say, this land is productive, this is unproductive. There are business opportunities for nature here. This is where we need to produce food. And so, you know, particularly in the earlier days, people were quite apprehensive about Wild to Waves and thinking, well, we can't just, you know, push people out of the landscape, and that's absolutely not what we're trying to do. And instead, we're trying to put farmers in that driving seat a little bit, and try and break down this barrier that's existed for so long of farmers versus conservationists, and it doesn't represent reality at all. There are really exciting opportunities now, and the business case for nature and the nature markets are going to really change the game.
Brilliant. Yeah, I think it's a bit of a misconception, isn't it? I think that nature recovery isn't against development. It never has been. I think it's just how you connect the projects together and how you get the best outcomes, whether that's for nature, whether that's for people, whether that's for business, whether it's for climate, and just trying to pull all that together. And I think that's the hardest job, obviously, as you as the coordinators of those bigger projects. That's the tricky bit. But when it works, it's fantastic, isn't it? And you just achieve amazing things together. We do have a few more questions, but we are got about a minute left. So what I'm going to do, I think I'll have to wrap up for now. But those questions, I think we've got about 4 outstanding. So I'll email them across to you, Mel and Alex, if that's okay. And then you can reply directly to those that have questioned. Thank you again for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to kind of have you on the partner webinar series. We've loved your presentation. It's fantastic, and you know, it is obviously a project close to our hearts at EcoSulis. And the amount of people that I speak to from all over the country know about the work that you're doing, and are amazed at what's happening. So it's just a great opportunity to kind of share it and tell your story. Thank you everybody for joining. We hope you have a great afternoon. Just as a reminder, I will be sending out the recording to everybody, so you'll be able to share it if you'd like to share it, and kind of watch it back. And we will come back to those that haven't had a chance to answer your questions as well. So thank you everybody. Have a great afternoon and rest of the week. Take care.